Okay. So if we could begin, is this working? Yeah. I'm John Ball, President of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and it's a very great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. We're very happy once again to be having a joint event with the Royal Institute of Philosophy, and the proceedings are going to be chaired by Edward Harcourt, who is the Academic Director of the Royal Institute of Philosophy. Edward.
Thank you very much, Sir John, and a warm welcome to everybody. It's very gratifying to see so many of you here. Thank you all for coming. This evening, the event is the 2024 Edinburgh Lecture, sponsored by the Royal Society, the Royal Institute of Philosophy, in proud and grateful collaboration with the Royal Society of Edinburgh. It's always such a pleasure to work with the Royal Society of Edinburgh, so thanks to all of you from Sir John down. We've been in almost constant contact since this equivalent event in 2023, without a glitch or a crossword, so long may the collaboration continue. It falls to me, although don't know the place as well as many of you do the housekeeping stuff. So there are no scheduled fire alarms. So in the very unlikely event that there is an alarm, it's the real thing, and the fire exit, it's where the green sign is over there. It's not very difficult to find. So we'll all file out in orderly fashion. But that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. What is going to happen is that we're going to hear a lecture by the real focus of this evening, Professor Pamela Hieronymi from the University of California at Los Angeles. A graduate of Princeton and Harvard, she's taught continuously at UCLA since finishing her PhD. She's published widely on ethics and moral psychology, with influential papers on forgiveness, blame, reasons, and other things, as well as serving as philosophical consultant, a very unusual job title, that, on the popular sitcom The Good Place. And tonight, her topic will be the puzzle of free will, problems in life, and a problem in theory. Pamela, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. It's an honor. Probably you're wondering about Kristen Bell. She's fantastic. It's a multimedia extravaganza. I don't have slides, but you have a handout. The handout might seem daunting, but we're going to go through it quite quickly, and I am going to let you know where we are. So let's get started. So there is, in fact, more than one philosophical puzzle about free will, and my goal today is going to be to identify one specific and especially recalcitrant problem that I believe I can unwind. It's not what I will call a problem in life, but rather a problem in theory. And it first appears as an apparent problem with explanation. A robust explanation of our decision-making seems both required to understand an event as an action and sufficient to threaten that action's freedom. So I'm going to argue that although explanation appears to threaten freedom, the underlying problem is about control. And it is this, that once we start to think about and explain the ordinary operation of our own agency, it seems that we're not really in control of that which we seem to control. The solution, I'm going to argue, is to expand our notion of control, and I will end by just sketching such an expanded notion, and that, I believe, will allow us to unwind the problem. And now we are already at section 2 on your handout. So to begin, I'm going to present what I take to be one of the most pressing problems in this area, and that is the case of the victim criminal. Philosopher Gary Watson highlights this case by introducing us to the person of Robert Alton Harris. In 1978, Harris and his brother carjacked 2 teenage boys, drove them to a remote place, and told them they could go free. As the boys were walking away, Harris shot them in the back, apparently for fun. He then walked over and shot them in the head, for good measure. Returning to the car, he finished the boys' lunches, and he fantasized about posing as a police officer to tell the boys' parents of their death. Harris was charged with first-degree murder, sentenced to death, and executed. Moving back in time. In 1953, Harris was born prematurely because his father had kicked his mother in her pregnant gut. According to Robert's siblings, he was the most tender and sensitive among them, desperate for any sign of affection. Yet his mother would touch him only to beat him. Without going into further detail, suffice to say that Robert Harris suffered from unrelenting, escalating abuse and deprivation. Hearing his story, it is far too easy to understand how he could grow to hate, and especially to hate those who seem to live happy lives of love. So Harris is a victim criminal. He commits a horrible crime. He was neither coerced nor under duress, and we have no reason to believe he suffers from a serious psychiatric disorder. Yet, as we learn of his history, we come to see him as a victim of circumstances that he could not control. He became so vicious, one might want to say, through no fault of his own. And so it seems to many people that his history should excuse him, or at least mitigate his culpability. And yet that reaction to Harris easily overgeneralizes. He can seem just an especially vivid case of what's true of each of us. Each of us, our choices and our character, are explained by our histories, and our histories are not chosen by us. We are, each of us, a product of nature and nurture, working in some contested combination. And those of us with garden variety, more or less decent upbringings, tend to live garden variety, more or less decent lives. So if the fact that an action has origins sufficient to explain it were enough to excuse it, we would excuse all wrongdoing. But that conclusion seems both too strong and also to have lost sight of what seems special about cases like Harris's. Okay, so although the victim criminal is among the most pressing problems about freedom and responsibility, I'm now going to set it aside. I introduce it both to illustrate the practical relevance of our topic and our genuine state of uncertainty and confusion in ordinary life. So I now move to the more traditional problems about free will and moral responsibility, which often start with God. And we are now at section 3. The traditional Judeo-Christian God both knows and does a lot of things, and in so knowing and doing seems to threaten human freedom. A classic example appears in Exodus when God orchestrates Moses' confrontation with Pharaoh. God explains to Moses that God will harden Pharaoh's heart against the Israelites so that God may better display God's power. That is to say, God acts directly upon Pharaoh's will, changing it to God's liking. It seems then that Pharaoh's will was not free. What he did, in fact, how he chose, was not up to him. It was up to God. Note, though, and this is important, that God does not prevent Pharaoh from choosing or acting, or even successfully exercising his royal power over the Israelites. In fact, Thomas Aquinas goes so far as to say that God does no violence to Pharaoh, because, as Aquinas put it, quote, "'tis contrary to the notion of violence for a man to be thus drug about by his own will." 'Tis contrary to the notion of violence for a man to be thus drug about by his own will. That's to say, because if God puts his finger right on Pharaoh's will and moves him around by that lever, no violence has been done. Pharaoh never does anything that Pharaoh does not at that moment will to do. And yet, it's clear that Pharaoh is unfree. Pharaoh's problem is not that he can't choose or act successfully. It's that his choices and actions are themselves being controlled by God for God's purposes. So Pharaoh's problem, it seems, is that his choices and actions are not up to him. They're up to God. Some will be tempted to say that though Pharaoh in fact chooses and acts exactly as God has him to do, Pharaoh does not really choose or act because of God's action upon him. Okay, more recently, Newton's physics has done duty for both divine omnipotence and divine omniscience, threatening human freedom. In the picture of the world as painted by Newton's science, events and states of the world at a given time are both explained and determined by prior events and states of affairs in accordance with mathematically precise causal laws or relations without remainder. Yet, uncomfortably, our own bodily actions are also part of the unfolding history of physical objects. Thus, it seems that our own actions are determined by prior events and states of affairs, which are in turn determined by earlier events and states of affairs, which are in turn determined by earlier ones, and so on, reaching back to well before we were born. Note that, as with Pharaoh, our trouble is not that we cannot act and choose. We can and do. But when we do, it seems that if determinism is true, then what we do is not up to us. Our choices are determined by forces beyond our control. Now, reflecting on the puzzle posed by Newtonian physics, many philosophers have noticed something puzzling. Namely, if we could somehow convince God to stay his hand, we would thereby restore Pharaoh's freedom. But simply denying the truth of determinism, updating to a more modern physics that includes indeterministic or probabilistic processes, will not thereby restore our freedom. Well, why not? Well, by denying the truth of determinism, we allow that some of the connections between past, present, and future are indeterministic. Some of those connections are probabilistic or chancy or stochastic. We thus allow for multiple possible futures, even given the past and the laws of nature. But, and this is crucial, processes that are chancy or stochastic are no more up to you or your own doing than processes that are deterministic. In fact, to whatever degree something is chancy, it is to that degree not up to you. It's up to chance. And so it seems that to many that an indeterministic scientific picture is no more hospitable to human freedom than a deterministic one. Denying determinism seems only to secure what Kant famously called the freedom of a turnspit. While we might swing this way or that, which way we swing is not up to us. It's up to chance. So something puzzling has happened. Somehow, in the shift from God to science, the nature of the problem has changed. Here's what I believe has happened. And now we're at section 4. When thinking about God and Pharaoh, we were assuming Pharaoh's agency. We were taking his agency for granted and considering God's interference with it, where by agency I just mean capacity to act. Right? So we were assuming that and considering God's interference with it. When we shifted to science, we moved from considering an interference with human agency to considering its operation. And then, when we try to explain and understand the operation of our agency, we encounter a very different sort of problem. We move from what I will call a problem in life to what I will call a problem in theory. So to elaborate, often when we say someone has acted freely, we mean that their ordinary intentional action was free from any interference, hindrance, or constraint. And often when we say someone is able to act freely, we mean that their capacity to act successfully is neither damaged nor defective. When God hardens Pharaoh's heart, Pharaoh is unfree because God is manipulating his will. He's interfering with his decision. And whenever someone is deceived, coerced, or subject to propaganda, they are, much like Pharaoh, thereby unfree or less free. When someone is bound, incarcerated, or impoverished, they face constraints on the execution of their actions that render them unfree or less free. Health and wealth remove constraints and thereby expand freedom. When someone suffers a serious addiction or a severe psychological order, their ability to act, their ability to bring things to be as they would have them to be, to do what they mean to do, is thereby damaged or distorted. They are not then able to act as freely. So each of those ways of being unfree are what I will call a problem in life. As I'm using it, a problem in life is an affront to freedom posed by interference, hindrance, constraint, damage, or defect. And a problem in life can, in principle, be avoided by eliminating the interference, etc. So again, if God would stay his hand, Pharaoh could act freely. In contrast, when we shifted from God to science, we moved from considering an interference with human agency to considering its operation. When we consider the operation of our agency, we consider the processes that underlie and constitute our ability to bring things to be as we would have them to be. And those include certain mental processes, such as the forming of an intention or the making of a decision, certain motor processes by which we execute bodily action, and other sorts of processes, for example, those that provide Pharaoh's political power to continue to enslave the Israelites. But when we turn to consider the processes that underlie, constitute, and explain the ordinary operation of our own agency, we run into a serious problem. If those processes are deterministic, then it seems we couldn't have done otherwise than act as we did, and so it seems we're unfree. But insofar as those processes are probabilistic, they're not up to us, and so again, it seems we're unfree. And so it seems that whether we model it as deterministic or probabilistic, when we stop to consider the processes that explain the operation of our agency, our decision-making was no more up to us than was Pharaoh's. And yet, whatever underlies, constitutes, and explains the ordinary operation of our agency cannot possibly be a hindrance, interference with, distortion of, or constraint upon it. That's a conceptual point. You couldn't even in principle remove that which explains our agency, hoping to restore the freedom of that agency. And yet, an account of what underlies and constitutes our agency seems to threaten our freedom. So our problem has changed. This is not a problem in life to be avoided, but rather a problem in theory to be understood and unwound. And we are now at section 5. So some will feel that in posing this supposed problem, I've been overlooking the obvious way in which determinism restores freedom, in which denying determinism restores freedom, namely by allowing certain merely chancy or stochastic processes within the system, we allow for points at which we can ourselves influence the otherwise underdetermined future. So denying determinism, they will think, opens up a gap in which we can act. Notice that if we could act in such a gap, then the truth of determinism would be what I'm calling a problem in life. Deterministic connections would pose a kind of constraint, a very global constraint, one that we could in principle avoid so long as we could open up those connections and allow some spots where we can exert our influence. But I'm now going to argue that that strategy merely postpones what I'm calling the problem in theory. This act in the gaps strategy comes in both an older and a newer version. The older version embraces something like Cartesian dualism, understanding us as immaterial substances, free spirits, or souls. Our immaterial minds somehow inhabit and interact with the material world like angels incarnate or ghosts in the machine. If we are such agents, then the truth of determinism would be a disaster for us, because the unfolding of physical events in the physical world, including the movement of our own body, would proceed without our input. We would make no difference to what happens. In contrast, if the unfolding of physical events is not fully determined, and if in addition we as immaterial minds had some way to interact with the material world, maybe a pineal gland, as Descartes thought, or some other kind of lever, then we might exert our influence in those moments in which the outcome is otherwise underdetermined. So for such Cartesian agents, Newtonian physics poses only a problem in life. The newer version of the act in the gaps strategy replaces the immaterial agent with a more familiar psychological one, but then claims that human psychology is an emergent phenomena, that the psychology emerges from the physical world without remainder and cannot be reduced back to it. More, this emergent agent can influence what happens in the physical world through what is sometimes called downward causation. So the emergent agent thereby acts in the gaps that have been left open by the denial of determinism. And again, determinism is now only a problem in life. But both of those forms of dualism, I claim, only postpone the problem in theory. Because whether we characterize our agency as immaterial or as emergent, we will eventually turn our explanatory project to the decision of the agent to consider its operation. When we do, the threat to freedom will reappear. So to elaborate, notice first that an event, the rising of your arm, say, or the swinging of your leg, qualifies as an action only if it happens because you meant for it to happen. If you raised your hand to ask a question or you were swinging your leg to shoo a fly, then that event that is your arm rising or your leg swinging is an action of yours, raising your hand to ask a question, shooing the fly. If that same movement were instead the result of a spasm or a seizure, then it's a mere event. It's not an action of yours. So we can't understand an event as something that happened because you meant for, if we cannot understand an event as something that happened because you meant for something to happen, we can't think of it as your action. Next, meaning for something to happen is a psychological state, and the ascription of one psychological state depends on others in a mind. We won't be able to understand you as having meant to do something unless we can appeal to some other features of your mind to make sense of that intention. You must have had some desire, impulse, urge, or some conviction, purpose, plan, belief, or aim, which would explain why you meant to do what you meant to do. And so we arrive at a necessary condition on action. Action must be the consequence of the operation of a mind, explained by that mind's characteristics. And that necessary condition applies even to Cartesian souls, or emergent minds. But further, and here the problem's going to reappear, those features of the mind that explain your meaning to do something will in turn be explained by something else. Sometimes earlier states of mind, perhaps earlier choices, but eventually by things that are not up to you at all. Nature, nurture, luck, maybe the underlying physics from which you irreducibly emerged, maybe God's creation of your soul in its individuality. Even immaterial or emergent minds will be subject to some such explanation. And if we are such minds, our decisions will again be explained by what we're like, while what we are like will be explained by things that are not up to us. And whether those explanations are deterministic, probabilistic, or divine, it will seem again that what we do is not ultimately our own doing. We've recreated the problem in theory, even for the Cartesian or the emergent mind. We're now at number 6. So at this point, some will insist that the threat to freedom doesn't appear for the Cartesian or the emergent minds because the threat doesn't appear with psychological explanation, but only with deterministic or mechanistic or maybe physical explanation. And the immaterial minds have avoided those. Sometimes this view about psychological explanation is held in conjunction with the view that that freedom is found in psychological indeterminacy or underdetermination. That is to say, freedom is found in those moments when, faced with some decision, you could, psychologically speaking, go either way. Chocolate or vanilla, New York or Paris, stay home and care for mother, or go off and fight for the Free French. In contrast, in those cases in which our cares, concerns, beliefs, and commitments align to make only one option psychologically available to us, betray our friend, never. Turn down our dream job, are you kidding? In those cases, we don't choose freely. So this common but peculiar position identifies freedom of choice with some level of ambivalence, indifference, or uncertainty about the options you face. And that would indeed preserve a great deal of freedom in life, because life is rife with moments of ambivalence, indifference, and uncertainty. But that is not an acceptable understanding of freedom upon reflection. It must be the case that we can be free even when, due to our loves, cares, etc., we wouldn't and couldn't do otherwise. So freedom is not psychological underdetermination. The view that psychological explanations are somehow no threat to freedom is sometimes instead held just more bluntly. But I don't see why psychological explanations pose any less of a threat to freedom than mechanistic or deterministic ones. That is, I don't see how just changing the level of explanation, shifting from neurons and chemicals to wants, desires, beliefs, loves, commitments, fears, insecurities, self-esteem, jealousy, addresses the intuitive threat. Loves and commitments, self-esteem and jealousy are explained by features of your history and environment. And if the victim criminal, due to their formative circumstances, lacks the strength of ego or capacity for empathy needed to regulate their desires in more sociable ways, then it seems he cannot regulate their desire in more sociable ways. And whether they have the strength of ego or capacity for empathy is a matter of nature, nurture, luck, and their past choices. But their past choices are ultimately a result of nature, nurture, and luck. And just the same is true of you. So if what you choose, if what you do is a function of what you're like, with or without some slippage, and what you're like is a product of what came before, with or without some luck, it seems intuitively that you're not free. And yet, it seems undeniable that even if you're an immaterial substance or an emergent self, what you do is a function of what you're like, with or without some slippage, and what you're like is a function of what comes before, with or without some luck. And so it seems that neither you nor the victim criminal is free to do otherwise. And so we can, I think, recreate the basic intuitive problem, the unsettling thought that appears with Enlightenment science, in merely psychological terms. While it may be that the human emerges from the physical in a way that defies reduction back to it, that doesn't free us from what shapes and ultimately explains our psychology or our choices. And so it will not, I think, assuage our concerns about freedom. If we were bothered by Newton, Freud will do just as well. So our problem seems vexed. We're now at 7. Psychological explanation seems both necessary to understand an event as an action and sufficient to threaten that freedom of that action. And so it seems that free action is impossible. That's a kind of paradox. And so what we encounter here is not a problem in life to be avoided, but a problem in theory to be understood and unwound. We're now at 8. The position I'll call conventional compatibilism responds by treating the argument just given as a kind of reductio of our intuitive sense that our freedom is threatened. Freedom, these compatibilists conclude, requires no more than the absence of problems in life. We are free when we can choose and act without interference, hindrance, constraint, damage, or defect. While Kant famously complained that this is only the freedom of a turnspit, the conventional compatibilist believes that the freedom of a fancy enough turnspit is all that is coherent, and therefore also all the freedom worth wanting. Now that's a highly sensible position, and in the end my own position is somewhat like it, but I think that simply denying the problem in theory is not satisfying, philosophically or otherwise. Partly because more can and should be said to assuage that intuition, and I'm going to say a bit more in a bit. But first, we're at number 9. Rather than deflate our sense of freedom, others confronted with this problem work to isolate action from explanation. One such strategy appeals to divine mystery. We cannot know how God makes a soul, but we can have faith that God does so in a way that's fair and that leaves us free. And that faith, together with the falsity of determinism, would leave us confident in our freedom, but only because we have taken solace in divine mystery. The great Immanuel Kant argued instead for a kind of in-principle mystery. I'm going to go quickly here. Kant's thought was that the world that Newton was describing, the empirical world, is the world as we experience it, in particular the world that comes to us through our own sensibility and understanding. And just as color or sound comes to us through our own sense modalities, so the world of science comes to us through our own minds. And he thought that was great for science. Science can knock itself out in the empirical world. But the empirical world, he said, is not the world as it is in itself, the world as it is apart from our own ways of experiencing it. And we have available to us a way of understanding how we are in ourselves, namely through pure moral reflection, and we can then know that we are free. Thus, he arrives at this sort of stunning kind of compatibilism. It turns out that the statement, the world as described by science, is fully deterministic, and the statement, we as we are in ourselves are free, are compatible because they're about different subject matters. One's about the world as described by science, the other is about the world as we are in ourselves. That does indeed solve the problem, but it of course sounds suspiciously like claiming that the empirical world, though adequate for scientific knowledge, isn't real, or it's not that the world as presented to us by science is in some sense illusory, at least with respect to our freedom. So by current standards, that is high metaphysics, and for the metaphysically generous, it can comfort. There are contemporary attempts to make use of this strategy without the mystery, but I'm going to skip over those in the interest of time. I don't think they work. So here is the state of play. We're now at number 10. I set aside problems in life. Though these are pressing, both practically and philosophically, I believe we are hindered in our progress on them by our confusion with the problem in theory. The problem in theory is an apparent problem with explanation. An adequate explanation of the genesis of an action can seem both necessary to understand the event as an action and also sufficient to show it unfree. So it seems there could be no free action. The conventional compatibilist concludes that our idea of freedom is overwrought. So long as we've avoided the problems in life, we're as free as we could possibly be or want to be. Others think it's a mistake to locate the problem with freedom as a problem with explanation. The problem, they say, will lie in deterministic or physical or mechanistic causation. Those objectors are worried about Newton, but not about Freud. But once we set aside the problems in life and consider the operation of our agency, I can't locate even an apparent problem with necessity that isn't equally a problem with chance. And I can't locate a problem with neurochemistry that's not equally a problem with ego strength or empathy. And so I believe that if Newton is a problem, so is Freud. And as evidence that the problem seems to be with explanation, I present Kant and his followers, whose strategy is to isolate explanation in order to make room for real freedom. But I'm now going to part ways with my Kantian comrades, because in the end, I agree that the problem with explanation is only apparent. In the end, explanation is benign, whether deterministic, chancy, physical, or psychological. Once we clear away the underlying philosophical difficulty, that which animates the problem in theory, the underlying philosophical difficulty, that which animates the problem in theory, is a somewhat simple problem, I think, with control. So to see that underlying problem, we're going to first consider what I call ordinary action, and we're now at 11. In a successful case of ordinary action, you both have in mind what you mean to do, and you do what you have in mind. You sink the shot, poison the guests, or appease your neighbor, as you meant to. In an unsuccessful case, you fail to do what you have in mind. Ordinary action, whether successful or not, thus displays a two-part structure. There's an intention or a having in mind of what you mean to do, and then the bringing about of that which you have in mind. The second part, the bringing about of what you have in mind, is the intention's execution, which may or may not be successful. Okay. Now we can consider what I'll call ordinary control. A thing, your body, your action, your car, your child, is in your ordinary control to the extent that you can successfully bring it to be as you would have it to be, to the extent that your intentions with respect to it are successful. Notice that the two-part structure of ordinary action carries over into ordinary control. The object of control, the thing controlled, is the second part, specifically that which you successfully do or bring about. When you sink the shot, you control your shot in the ordinary way. But the first part of ordinary action, the having in mind of what you mean to do, the decision or intention itself, is not the object of control, nor is it controlled in the ordinary way. You don't control your intention by having in mind the intention you mean to intend and then bringing it about that you intend it. that would require forming and executing a second intention about the first. And then you would need to control that second with a third, and so on. So we launch an immediate and vicious regress. So when we turn to consider the ordinary operation of our agency, we notice that we do not and apparently cannot control our own intending in the ordinary way. Worse, because we don't control our own decision as we decide to sink the shot, it seems that we're not really in control of the shot either, any more than Pharaoh was really in control of the Israelites. Because we're no more in control than Pharaoh, it seems we're also not really free. So that problem about control, I submit, is the recalcitrant underlying problem of free will. Okay. I'm going to turn to objections in a moment, but first I owe a diagnosis. If the underlying problem is about control, how did we come to think it was a problem about explanation? Well, when we turn to consider the ordinary operation of our agency, we notice not only that we're not controlling our own willing, but also that our own willing is successfully explained by other things. And then our attention is captured by those other things, which then seem to be controlling what we do. That is to say, it seems to us not only that we're not in the driver's seat, so to speak, but that those other things are occupying that role. And then we wrongly assume that we're not in the driver's seat because those other things are occupying that role. And if we could eliminate them, that we would return to our rightful place. That is to say, we wrongly think that those things that explain our willing are acting upon us like God on Pharaoh. And so we mistake the underlying problem for a problem with explanation. But in fact, the recalcitrant problem is one step earlier. If our only notion of control is the ordinary notion of control, then our own willing is not in our control. And if our own willing is not in our control, then it seems nothing is. Okay, we're now at 12. The conventional compatibilist will remain unimpressed. They will say that any notion of control that leaves nothing in your control must be inadequate as an idea of control, a kind of unattainable confusion or an illusion, something we should give up. But I think this claim about control is implausible. To see why, consider an old-fashioned mechanical thermostat with a metal spring inside. The ambient temperature of the room causes the expansion or contraction of a metal spring, which in turn opens and closes a circuit, which turns the heat off or on, ensuring a steady temperature. We say that the thermostat controls the temperature of the room, and it controls the temperature of the room by bringing things to be as its internal structure would dictate. So the thermostat mimics ordinary control. But again, I think we wouldn't want to call this real control. We can call the ability to bring things to be in accord with your internal structure, whether or not that structure is up to you, mundane control. So if our own decision-making is not itself in our control, then like the thermostat, we enjoy only mundane control. We simply affect changes in accord with our admittedly far more complex internal structure, while the composition of that structure is itself dictated by things beyond our control. The conventional compatibilist would have us rest content with the control of a thermostat. But that, I submit, is too big a bullet to bite. And more, we can do better. So a very different kind of objection to the underlying problem will come from those who want to point out that we can control our wills in the ordinary way. We're now at 13. They will point out that enjoying ordinary control over a thing does not always require that one actually then be acting upon it. For example, the state of your apartment or your finances is not always at each moment the object of your own controlling activity, and yet it's not for that reason out of your control. It's enough that you have the ability and the opportunity to effect it at the appropriate time. We can call this managerial control. And the opponent suggests that because we enjoy managerial control over our intentions, they are in control. But it's important to see this suggestion sharply. The objector grants that the intention with which you're controlling the chalk, say, as you write on the blackboard, is not in that moment, in that exercise of ordinary control, something you're controlling. In that moment, you're controlling the chalk, not your intention. Even so, they argue, your intention isn't out of your control, even at that point, any more than your apartment or your finances are out of your control when you're out for a jog. It's in your control because you can manage it. You have a reasonable ability and adequate opportunity to turn your attention to it, maybe right there in reflection, and put your intention into the role of the chalk, and thereby make it into the object of a further stretch of ordinary control. Now, of course, when you manage one intention, you're going to form a second higher order intention, and that higher order intention will not itself be something you're then controlling in the ordinary way. And if you're not also in control of that higher order intention, then you're not going to be in control of the lower order one. So you're going to be like a thermostat with a second spring that's controlling the first spring. So now we have to ask, how are you in control of that higher order intention? And the objector is going to repeat the strategy. They will say you don't actually have to be controlling that higher order intention, you just have to be able to manage it. And they will point out you can. And so, but in fact, the objector will need to say that for any arbitrarily higher order intention, you could manage it. And thereby they will conclude that our intentions are really in our control after all. The problem with this objection or this strategy is that the mere possibility of affecting a thing and bringing it to be as you would have it to be is not enough to put it in your ordinary control. For example, it's possible, though alas not true, that I cast the deciding vote. But the outcome of the election is not thereby in my managerial control. To count as enjoying managerial control over a thing, you have to enjoy some limited, partial, imperfect, fallible ability to bring the thing as you would have it to be, and you must have an adequate opportunity to exercise that ability. But it's simply implausible to claim that we have the ability to manage an arbitrarily higher order intention. At some point, our capacities for reflection will just give out. So although we do enjoy managerial control over our intentions, so far, I think we have no reason to think that this is anything more than the control of a sophisticated thermostat, one that has second and third order springs. The thermostat does, in a way, control its own setting, but that's still mundane control, not real control. So I don't think we can bootstrap ourselves out of this problem by appeal to managerial control. If our willing is not already in our control, we can't bring it into our control by turning it upon itself. We need an alternative form of control. And happily, we have one. We're now at 16. It's the control we enjoy with respect to our own answers to questions. So I suggest that we resolve the underlying problem by noticing that we control our own intentions not in the ordinary way, in which we control our actions or the things that we intentionally affect through our actions, but rather in the way that we control our own answers to questions. And that's not ordinary control. It lacks some of the most salient features of ordinary control, and so it can seem a strange or even unsatisfying form of control. But I believe it shares enough of the features of ordinary control to deserve to be thought of as a kind of control. It will allow us to see that we enjoy more than the mundane control of a thermostat, and thereby unwind the problem in theory at its root. So let us think about the control we enjoy with respect to our answers to questions. We're now at 17. Importantly, when I refer to your own answer to a question, I don't mean your verbal response to a question, but rather the answer that you arrive at for yourself, that which a verbal response might or might not sincerely report. When you resolve a question in your own mind, your mind therein changes. By answering a question for yourself, you literally make up your mind. You create or constitute or construct parts of it. Hamlet said, "There's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so." And he was expressing subjectivism about value, which is controversial. But there should be no controversy that when it comes to thought, thinking makes it so, makes it objectively so. Notice next that beliefs and intentions are well understood as our positive answers to certain yes or no questions. It should be uncontroversial to claim that to answer for yourself the question of whether some proposition is true, to answer for yourself the question of whether P positively is to believe that P. To answer for yourself the question of whether the butler did it positively is to believe the butler did it. To answer for yourself positively the question of whether to act in some way is to intend to act in that way. So now we can compare and contrast the ordinary control we enjoy over our actions and what I will call the evaluative control that we enjoy with respect to our answers to questions. And we're now at 18. It's important to concede up front that the activity of question answering lacks two features of ordinary action which seem most salient when we think about control, what I will call awareness and what I will call voluntariness. When you intend to act, you have in mind what you mean to do. You are so, in some sense, aware of what you mean to do. In contrast, when you answer a question, you don't represent your own answering of it. When you settle the question of whether the butler did it, you don't need to think about your own mind or your own psychology. You don't represent your own belief. You think about the butler and the crime, things at a distance from you in space and time. So you needn't be aware of your own psychology when settling a question that doesn't concern it. Second, unlike ordinary action, answering a question is not what I will call voluntary. This is a technical sense of voluntary that I've worked out in other places. A thing is voluntary in this technical sense if you can do it for any reason that you think shows it worth doing. But you can't answer a question for any reason that you think shows it worth answering. So to illustrate that, suppose that you're unsure whether or not everything will work out, that your uncertainty is causing you significant anxiety, that your anxiety leaves you unable to sleep, and that given the challenges you will face the next morning, a good night's sleep is extremely important. Let us stipulate both that answering the question of whether things would work out would allow you the much needed sleep, and that your need for sleep, that you take your need for sleep all by itself to show that answering that question would be well worth doing, even if only for the night. Still, you won't be able to answer the question of whether everything will work out in order to get some sleep, because presumably you don't take your need for sleep to show that everything will work out. As it's sometimes put, you cannot believe at will. In contrast, there's a lot of actions you could perform in order to get some sleep. You could count some sheep or have some warm milk. So there's a lot to be said about this notion of voluntariness, and I've said a lot about it, but I'm going to let the example stand for our purposes as an illustration. So we need to concede up front that answering a question is not voluntary, cannot be done at will. It's rather in our evaluative control. We're now at 19. So now I'm going to argue that evaluative control nonetheless is a form of control. So evaluative control is similar to ordinary control in that when you exercise ordinary control, you bring something to be as you would have it to be. And likewise, when you answer a question for yourself, you also bring something to be, namely your own answer, a state of mind. But you don't bring your answer to be as you would have it, the state of mind, to be. That's what we just saw in the sleeping case. Rather, when you answer a question, you will answer in whatever way you take to be correct. And that you answer a question as you take to be correct is a conceptual fact about answering. In coming to an answer in your own mind, you therein, at least at that moment, in that part of your mind, take that answer to be correct. Now, admittedly, you can be, as we sometimes say, of two minds on a question. Still, if you don't take that answer to be correct, at least at that instant, at least in some part of your mind, you haven't answered the question. There's no such thing as answering a question for yourself in a way that you yourself, at that instant and in that part of your mind, take to be incorrect. Because answering is answering as you take to be correct, answering a question, though not in your ordinary control, is not simply out of your control. It doesn't happen to you, like aging or having a headache or seeing spots. Nor is it the inadvertent or unforeseen consequence of something you were doing intentionally, like crushing a toy as you back out of the driveway. Rather, your answering is, in an important sense, up to you. Well, in what sense is it up to you? There's a lot to say here, but I'll just give the briefest sketch. First, while you can perform an ordinary action for any reason that you take to show it worth doing, you can similarly answer a question for any reason you take to bear sufficiently on it. There's something like the discretion of voluntary action. Next, while ordinary action unfolds over time and might fail, If you change your mind on some question, your mind cannot fail to change. The relation between answering a question and the answer is immediate and fail-safe. And importantly, questions always admit of more than one answer, at least in principle. Even when an answer is clear, incontroversial, necessary, there will be at least two, in principle, alternative answers. So does 2 and 2 equal 4? Yes or no? Even if it would be unthinkable for you to answer no, your answering the question still amounts to, it just is, you're closing off or denying the in principle available to you no answer. Fourth, and relatedly, answers are essentially contestable. They're the kind of thing that can always in principle be reconsidered. You've closed off an alternative, but that alternative is always in principle available. The answer is essentially updatable. So if you find yourself unable to revise an answer simply by reconsidering the question, that will be because you are yourself convinced of that answer. So you might, even though you might find yourself stuck with some answer and so unable to sleep, you're not what I will call simply stuck with it in the way you're simply stuck with your headache or your birthplace. You're stuck with it because you take it to be correct. So your answers are in each of these ways, each of which deserves a lot more elaboration, up to you. They are in what I'll call your evaluative control. So we can now return to the underlying problem. We're now at 20. I claimed it was this. When we consider the explanation of our own actions, we notice that when we control our actions or things in our environment, we're not in the same way controlling the intention by which we exercise control over the thing. It can then seem that our intention, our own decision-making and willing, is out of our control. And it then seems that we enjoy only the control of a thermostat. We don't really control anything. And we can now avoid that problem. We can grant that we do not always nor ultimately control our intentions in the ordinary way, while denying that they are out of our control. They're in our control, not because we stand behind them in space and time, bringing them to be as we would have them to be, not because we create them on purpose or influence them intentionally. Instead, they're in our control because of the kind of thing they are. They're our own answers, and they persist only insofar as we maintain them as correct. And so we can say why we enjoy more than the control of a thermostat. The thermostat affects the environment in accord with its internal structure, and so in a way brings about that which it represents. But its representation of that which it will bring about is not in its evaluative control. It couldn't be. The thermostat doesn't have a mind, but we do. And our minds enable us to answer questions for ourselves. We have a take on the world and on our place in it, on what's true, important, worth doing, appalling, wonderful, terrifying, outrageous, etc. And our states of mind, as answers to our questions, manifest that take on the world. Our take on the world is not voluntary. It couldn't be. But our take remains in our evaluative control. It comes with built-in alternatives. It's essentially contestable. We can always revise it for any reason we take it to show it incorrect. So it is, in that way, up to us. And so our control, even of ordinary things, is not the mundane control of a thermostat. We don't merely affect changes in accord with our internal structure. Our internal structure is, so to speak, up to us. We bring things to be as we would have them to be. And so unlike the thermostat, we really control things, so long as we avoid the problems in life. And that final caveat about problems in life is crucial. Aquinas said that no violence could be done to the will, and in a similar way, we might be tempted to say that your will or intentions cannot be out of your evaluative control. But like Aquinas' understanding of violence, the control we enjoy over our own will offers us no protection from manipulation, interference, or constraint. It offers us no protection from the problems in life, and so does not secure our freedom or even what one might want to call real control. For that, we need to avoid the problems in life, which is to say we need to treat one another well. But I believe that we can say that so long as we avoid those many problems in life, so long as we treat one another well, then we are really in control of our own minds in the way that a thermostat is not, and in the only way I think we could be. And so we are really in control of that which we seem to control. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now over to you for Q&A. We've got a good half hour. There's a microphone which will rove around. Yes, we have one quite close to the front, and we also have some questions online. If you're attending online and you'd like to ask a question, please put your question in the chat and we'll try to get to you. But please go ahead.
So my background is physics, and I'm also interested in artificial intelligence. So your comparison to a thermostat was particularly interesting to me. I don't particularly see the difference between a human and a thermostat in the sense that the underlying processes are similar. You can compare a thermostat to an AI as it becomes more elaborate. We're not at the level of complexity of humans yet, obviously, but I know people who would like to change that. And I wasn't clear on why making an intention, like a decision to do something, is different from answering a question, because you could argue that an intention is simply you're asking yourself what you're going to do today. So although I enjoyed the talk and I followed and agreed with it most of the way along, when you came to that last page and a half, I think, I couldn't quite understand how this, I think it's all in the ordinary control, right? In the difference between real control, real control and ordinary control. Sorry if that was a long.
No, that's very good. So actually, I think it's in the idea of what it is to have a mind. So so we are unlike thermostats, I say, because we have minds and they do not. And the AI question, sort of, you can ask, okay, well, but what about the artificial intelligence? Does it have a mind? And I think that's an interesting question. I mean, I think not as it is now, but maybe as it will be. So what is it to have a mind? A different piece of your question is, isn't an intention just a question settling? Yes, precisely. Intending is settling a question. And it's settling a question for oneself, which is something I think we do and the thermostat does not. So what makes it the case that we settle a question for ourselves and the thermostat does not? I do think it's a matter of complexity. So there I agree. That in terms of, it's not that as you get more complex, you somehow break free of the physical world. So in that sense, the artificial intelligence and the thermostat are the same. That's part of the goal of this picture, is to not require mystery or not require independence of the physical world. So it is a matter of gaining in complexity, but the kind of complexity that it's gaining in is allowing us to talk about it in terms of beliefs, decisions, intentions, in terms of these psychological states that then carry significance for one another in a way that the plans executed by a simple computer now doesn't carry the same significance. So there's a lot more to be said about that, but the difference is in what it is to have a mind. And then this lecture pairs with another set of lectures that talks about what it is for that mind to matter to other people in the way that humans matter to one another. So it's more promissory, but that's my attempt to respond.
Yes, at the front.
Thank you for the very interesting talk. If you wouldn't mind, or if you could elaborate a little on that, I had difficulties understanding the difference between when you talk about evaluative control versus not having control over your intention. Because in my mind, that evaluative control, as far as I understood it, would be the same as the issues with external factors influencing your intention. And so you would have as little evaluative control as you would over your intentions and therefore acting on them.
Good. So So the evaluative control is meant to give us a sense in which our intentions, our beliefs, our answers to questions are up to us, even though they're fully explained by what went before. So it's the notion of ordinary control has that two-part structure. We have to have something in mind and then bring it about. And it's that two-part structure that creates the regress problem. Whereas in evaluative control, there's no two-part structure, right? You answer a question, and that is you're answering the question and having the answer is the same thing. It is, at the same time, explained by your history, but at the same time that it's explained by your history, it's also in the sense that not in the sense that you created it in space and time, but in the sense that it's your answer, you take it to be correct, you can revise it, it's essential. In those senses, it's up to you. So that's what it's trying to do. And I should say, again, this is paired with another set of talks. I don't think evaluative control is by itself enough to ground moral responsibility. Right? So if you thought we were getting moral responsibility out of this, that would be, it would seem inadequate, and I agree. But I do think it's enough to say why we're not like a thermostat.
So we're asking the same question, I think. And so let me ask it in a different way. So you talked about the layers of abstraction. And actually, I tend not to hang out with philosophers because I find some of this very, I sometimes find it difficult that it's not grounded in physical reality. And I'm a physicist, and that's problematic for me, not for everyone, though. But this issue of top-down causality seems to be in there somewhere. It seems to me that what you're talking about in terms of evaluative control actually has some overlap with the idea of top-down causality, because you're talking about beliefs and decisions and these things that somehow have non-physical operation, that are somehow coming outside of what I would call normal physical control. So I would feel so much more satisfied if we could unpick that and just get what is the difference between a belief, in your words, and in my words, the way my neurons have been, the weights of my neurons have been molded by my experience and the accident of my birth and my genetics to make something happen in a particular way, for me to make a decision or for me to believe something, also based on my experience coming in from my eyes and my ears and all of that, which is what I think about in AI terms all the time.
So it might be nothing. I mean, that's a hard scientific question. Like, what's the relation between the wetware and the psychology? I doubt there's a nice one-to-one mapping, but for everything I'm saying now, there could be a one-to-one mapping. Like, it could be just identity. So again, what I'm trying to do is make available to us a sense in which things are up to us, that doesn't depend on us finding a gap there or finding some magic outside of the physical. Just let the physical thing be the whole story at that level of description, so to speak. And I don't need any downward causation. Just let the causation run there. It's still the case that somehow, and there's a story, and let there be a scientific story to be told about how, we have thoughts in which that can be true or false. We make decisions that can be good or bad, and we're accountable to one another as we do that. And in that set of significance and meaning, that's where our notion of control, I think, comes in, and that's where our ideas of freedom come in. So I'm not looking to have it down. I'm not looking to kind of get into the causal story somewhere. I'm looking to say why, as human beings who take ourselves to matter, we can take ourselves to matter without worrying about the causal story. Let the causal story do what it does. I mean, we do in fact cause things. I mean, when we bring things to be as we would have them to be. So there we can tell a story. But then how do we control our own decisions? Well, our decisions, in one sense, happen by whatever physical things happen. But at the very same time, we make them. They're up to us. Those are the things I'm trying to put together.
Okay. So let's have a 4 rows back. Yes. Take the mic. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, you began the talk very interesting with the, empirical example of Alton Harris and problem in life and problem in theory. Perhaps another way of looking at it is that the theory that we're looking at is wrong, and that there's far too much emphasis in this approach that you're taking on individualism. And you mentioned Cartesian dualism and determinism, and a lot of science emanates from that way of thinking. What about a perspective that would be based more on, say, Heidegger's work or Wittgenstein's work, which decenters the role of the individual and looks at things in a much more social and contextual problem? Any thoughts on that?
Well, that's in a way the answer I was giving over here, is that our agency, the states of mind that we the states of mind that we form are up to us because of the significance they have for one another. I was just thinking about whether an example that might help, though it's a little complicated, is Brave New World. So in Brave New World, it's a dystopian future in which different levels of society have been completely conditioned to be so happy at whatever level they're doing, and everyone. And so my favorite are the betas, because they're the helpmeets to the alpha. So they seem to be like the feminine, right? They're so happy they're a beta. They don't have to make those horrible decisions the alpha has to make. Right? So there's a serious problem with freedom. There's a political problem with freedom, that their lives are being controlled by, it's like God acting on Pharaoh. But there's not a problem with their agency. So set aside moral responsibility, acknowledge this is a serious problem in life. Even though their thoughts have been conditioned, their thoughts are still up to them, right? I can still go to the beta and be like, why are you happy like this? And she still owes me an answer, right? So I mean to be drawing pretty heavily on the social and the social significance of these states of mind.
Okay. That wasn't clear to me that was the case, but you've now said it, so.
Okay, yes, well, a couple of rows back. Oh, I beg your pardon. No, go ahead. I didn't see you had the microphone, and then I'll come to you.
Okay, like when you talked about the intrusions and the problems and things like that, like it reminded me about the irrational beliefs that we have. Like Albert Ellis, like the psychologist, he mentioned about 11 irrational beliefs, like all the shoulds that we think about, like everybody should like me and I should do everything right and everybody should be doing things correctly, like some such things, like all the shoulds that we have. And that is a reason, like always we have that in our mind, and then we think like if it is not there, like that becomes a problem for us. So I think like that might be related to like what you're talking about. Like we have the thought process, and the thought process we have acquired it from the society and whatever we have got. And we know that we have this, but still we find it difficult to move on and let go of things. So there is a gap there. Like we know from where we got it, but we are unable to process it. There's a gap there.
So yes, simply knowing from where you got it doesn't itself allow you to move from it. You have, but I mean, notably, re-asking the question can sometimes bring you to a different answer. And if it doesn't bring you to a different answer, that's because you're conflicted in some way, which is a problem in life.
Couple of rows back, yes.
Hi, Pam. I have two questions to get you to say a little bit more. So one, you've commented on a bit already, the relationship between evaluative control as dealing with a problem in theory, and then some of these problems of life issues. So you suggest that someone could be in evaluative control, but not be morally responsible because of a problem in life issue. So the first question is sort of, where does freedom fit in here? How does problems in life restrict freedom? So could you have a free action, say, that you weren't morally responsible for, or does freedom drop out because of problems in life? So that's one question. And the other question is an invitation to tell us a little bit about the intellectualist conception of free will in the history of philosophy and how your view connects to it, because sort of that's what I was thinking when you were elaborating your conception of evaluative control. So how is it similar or different from that conception of freedom?
So hum a bar for me on what you have in mind for the intellectualist conception.
Right. So very strong version of it that you find in some early Christian thinkers, for example, is the action is a free action when it's grounded in a correct, justified belief in what's fundamentally good. And so when you're doing something for the good, that's when it's free. And so a fully formed, non-defective will acting for the good, that's when they're acting freely. And so it's connected to a type of the quality of the reasoning, so to speak, that leads to the decision.
Yeah, good. So that's a cousin of Kant. And then there's other cousins of Kant in what I call the contemporary two standpoints views. My problem with Kant and with the view that you just sketched is that it leaves it unclear how you could be responsible for bad action. So it seems like insofar as an action is bad, it's also unfree, but if it's unfree, it should be excused. So now it seems you don't get a responsible vice. Remind me your first question?
So the first question was sort of where does freedom lie in between control and problems in life?
See, I carefully forgot that. In the word free in the end, I find really hard to pin down because so many people use it in so many ways. One thing I would like to say is that the problems in life are ways of being more and less free. Freedom in the sense that the incompatibilist has in mind, or in the sense that Kant has in mind, I think we don't have. I think that evaluative control gives us a form of agency that is the agency that we're responsible for. Some people think that if we're responsible for it, that's free agency. So if you want to use free that way, I'm okay with it. But like free just gets used in so many ways, it's hard to keep control of it. And so but those are some answers I would give.
Yes, sort of in the middle. I will come back to you if we have time, but just trying to let people have a go who haven't spoken yet.
Very interesting talk. I wanted to ask you about the caveat at the end. So, so long as we don't suffer problems in life, we can have this kind of control that we could have. I guess the question I wanted to ask you was, how committed are you to the caveat actually holding that we don't? So, I mean, you started out the talk kind of wanting to separate the problems in life from the problems in theory, but I guess I could imagine someone thinking, well, in the end of the day, our answers to the questions are always subject to some sort of hindrance, interference, manipulation, lack of full health, or whatever all the other problems in life are that you were mentioning, unless we could be completely free of all those hindrances, your caveat's not going to hold, and so we're never going to have the kind of control that you think we have. And I just wondered, do you have anything to say to that kind of skeptic?
It's not that we would never have the kind of control that I think we have, because I think we have evaluative control. I think we sometimes enjoy ordinary control, but then the question is, are we really free? And to be really free, I think you also need to be free from the problems in life. Or do you have real control? Okay, now we need to be free from the problems in life. And as you point out, that's going to be a matter of degree. So I agree that'll be a matter of degree. I don't think, I mean, I'm hesitating, but I mean, I do think that the question of when is something a manipulation, when is something coercion, or when something a threat or an offer, when is it coercion or persuasion, that those, and there's a whole long list of those, that those distinctions, the result of this view is that they're not, we don't make those distinctions by first figuring out whether freedom has been interfered with. It'll be a consequence of our reasoning about those distinctions whether or not freedom has been interfered with. So we just go at those questions directly by asking, what's the right way to treat one another? And so those are ethical questions, not metaphysical questions, answered by thinking about our interests and how it is that we can treat one another decently. I think there will be, I do think it's a constraint on the question of what is it to treat one another decently, that it has to sometimes be possible to do it, right? So I do think there's a little bit of a constraint there. But at the same time, you know, I think these will come in degrees.
There's somebody right at the back.
So I was wondering if you can elaborate more on this evaluative control. So you're saying it's kind of like an answer of what you take to be correct, but isn't it just like what you take to be correct isn't not necessarily what is correct? So shouldn't you have the right kind of evaluation to think of the right answer, right? So isn't it enough, so isn't it insufficient to think of it in terms of like what you take to be correct? Shouldn't you also be concerned about having the right way to evaluate the correct answer?
Well, when you take it to be correct, you think it is the right way. But it's true that you might not, that you're fallible. So this is interacting with Peter's question from earlier. It's part of what's enabling me to say that you're responsible for your mistakes, because it's what you take to be correct, not what is correct. Whereas if I said that you were in control only when you were in fact correct, now we're never going to know whether we're actually in control, because it's hard to know whether we're actually correct, and we're not going to be responsible for our mistakes.
Yes, over to the side.
Thanks again for the talk. You've mentioned a couple of times things like moral responsibility, and the sort of interlinking there with why we should feel responsibility for other people. Do you think it's impossible to come up with a framework where you could ascribe things like moral responsibility to other people in society without free will, without some kind of control internally? And if it's not impossible, might it be easier to sort of just assume there is no free will and proceed on that basis?
Good. So I've gotten this far without giving my pitch. This was part of a book that I'll be, publishing in the next year or so, which is about free will and moral responsibility. So the back half and this half will go together. So if what you mean by freedom here, when you say, is it that we just don't have freedom, is what the incompatibilist means by freedom. So the thing that's threatened by determinism, that gets into, that couldn't be true if determinism was true, that needs gaps. If what you think by freedom is that, could we be responsible without that? Yes, that's the point of this whole book, is to say we can be responsible even if determinism is true, even if we're just physical things. How does that work out? Well, first, we need to understand ourselves as in control of ourselves. And then we need to think about what it is to be responsible in a way that is suited to the kind of control we in fact enjoy. And so that second bit, so we do need a little, so the line of the book is we can unwind the problem of free will and the problem of free will and responsibility is a philosophical problem in the pejorative sense. That is to say, it's a problem we get into because of our natural models of things clash with one another. The solution is to do some remodeling. You have to remodel from both ends. So you have to, it's coming from our overly narrow idea of what it is to control something. That's the talk I just gave. That we have the ordinary notion and we need an expanded notion. But then it's also coming from an off-center idea of what it is to be responsible. And so that's the other half of the project, which I keep gesturing at, but not actually give you. You'll have to come back for the book.
Now I see you. I'm going to come to you in a second. I'm going to slip in a question of my own. So I'm not quite sure that I've got hold of your idea of forming an intention, but so correct me if I've got it wrong. But here's an example. So what do I want? I want to fix the lamp. How do I fix the lamp? If I'm going to fix the lamp, I need a 13 amp fuse. So I'll fit a 13 amp fuse. Mm-hmm. That might be said to be an example of answering your question about how to fix the lamp by forming an intention. Mm-hmm. Now, like a piece of theoretical reasoning where you draw a conclusion from, infer from a conclusion from a set of premises, you might say that a funny thing about that kind of answering your own question about what shall I do is that you kind of feel compelled. You think, unless I have to answer the question this way because of the information I've got, maybe I've got the answer wrong. And so my worry about your theory of evaluative control is that you're answering a question about freedom by giving an example, an unusual example of compulsion. Mm-hmm. How does that work? For the philosophers in the room, it's not an accident that my teacher was Harry Frankfurt. Okay. And he has a paper called The Importance of What We Care About, where he has a line that says, I'm not going to get it quite right, but it's remarkable that we have overlooked the fact that experiences of rationality and of love, which are experiences of necessity, are also characteristically experiences of freedom. So I take that very seriously. Mm-hmm. So I think that the sense of compulsion you're talking about, that so his example was Martin Luther, here I stand, I can no other. My example in the talk was, it's my dream job, of course I'm accepting it. That those aren't examples of unfreedom. And to think that they are, it seems to me, is to think that freedom lies in those moments in which it seems to you you could go either way, which are moments of indifference or ambivalence or uncertainty. But that I just find an implausible idea of what freedom means. So what I like about settling a question, and I focus on yes-no whether questions, so the question of whether to phi, not what shall I do. But what I like about the idea of settling a question is that it allows for both kinds of cases. It allows for the here I stand, I can no other case, and it also allows for the case in which, chocolate, vanilla, chocolate, and it puts them both in the same framework. So you're saying that a kind of Frankfurt-like answer to the question that we're, as it were, at our most free when there's nothing else we could do, there are many, many more cases of that fit that template than just the Martin Luther type case.
There might be, but it's also, this is in a way, again, coming back to Peter's question, that the structure I've given, or the analysis I've given, handles both the Martin Luther case and the chocolate and vanilla case in the same way.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah, okay. Sorry, I butted in, but you go for it. You need a microphone.
To say a bit about your dialectical position with regard to compatibilism. So sometimes I hear you as a kind of sophisticated compatibilist, and sometimes I hear you as basically saying that the question the compatibilist asks is a bad question. So the compatibilist will, the simple one will say, look, there's no problem with free will because as long as the causal chains run through our psychological states, we're free. And if you're a compatibilist, then you basically agree with that. You just sort of emphasize, but there's this further thing, evaluative control, and that's really important, and that's why one might think there is a problem. There's a different way to think of what you're doing, which is in a way to change the topic and say that topic, the topic that the compatibilist, along with the hard incompatibilist and the libertarian, that topic is a bad topic because it's about a ill-conceptualized notion of freedom. And what we really should talk about is what we really need to understand is evaluative control. Anyway, so the latter position would not be a compatibilist position, but would be a kind of let's ask a better question. Which is it?
I'm going to disappoint you and say it's the first. No, I mean, I do think of myself as sort of as compatibilist as you could be, except that, as you say, I think there's there's a thing we can say about the sense in which it's up to us. Now, I'm open to the idea that shows that we've been asking the wrong question all along, but not in a way that I mean, this I think is our disagreement, right? Like, so I want, in a way, to be able to come back to the neuroscientist and the AI engineer, and talk with them about what they're doing in a way that connects to it being up to us. I don't want. I think that it's a compatibilism that wants those projects to be able to talk to one another. So, which I know you don't like. Sorry.
Yes, right at the very back.
Thank you for your speech. So, as putting theory into practice and into like real life implication of it, if there is no free will, and that is a thought that people start to develop, that may result in a motivation or kind of demoralization from basically feeling this lack of autonomy. So how would you suggest that be combated? This, if you take away this idea of autonomy, then there's a lack of motivation to, what's the point if all of the actual will I have is chocolate or vanilla and that's mundane, then where's the push to strive for something else? Or does that make sense?
So there's I'm not quite. So there's different problems there's different worries you might be having. One is that there are studies that say that if you expose people to too much philosophy, they despair, and that's sad. I think, and I think the answer, you won't be surprised, is a little more philosophy, right? I think if you like keep pushing through it, like, no, in the end, these things are up to you. Nothing's going to happen unless you do it. There's every reason in the world to keep, right? So in a way, my answer to the problem of free will and moral philosophy free will and moral responsibility is grace and courage. Have grace with one another and take courage because things still matter. Like that's so you might have that worry. You might be having a different worry, which is that if I don't have free will, nothing I do makes a difference. But that one's if determinism is true, of course it makes a difference. If you don't do it, it's not going to happen, right? It's also true that given the past, you will or won't do it, that it's already been predetermined whether you will or won't. But it's not that you don't make a difference, right? So I'm not sure which of those thoughts you have. I'm suspecting maybe the first one.
Yeah, I think it's whenever I start to have this discussion with someone, then they get very defensive out of like kind of a fear response, I can tell, because they're like, well, if I don't have any control over this, then, you know, they go to the despair point. And it takes some time to, it's almost a grieving process, realizing you don't have any free will. But I think the big argument that I've gotten from other people that, you know, still pondering about is the personal responsibility aspect. Is that, like, though you may have that moral compass, if you feel like, oh, like the fact that you don't have any free will justifies bad behavior, I suppose, is like a potential concern in that philosophy.
So I'll say that this may only tangentially relate, but so Thomas Nagel has a paper in which he says he's reflecting on the common experience of sort of staring up at the sky into the stars and thinking about how vast the universe is and how far away everything is, and coming to feel like, you know, your problems are not, they don't matter that much. And he's like, what is happening here, right? I mean, we know that there is absolutely no correlation between size and importance, right? Like magnitude and importance. They just like, but somehow when we think of ourselves as small, we also think, right? So that there's something that happens to us that's very natural in those moments. And I want to say that there's something similar with this free will problem, that somehow when we start to think of ourselves as physical, we lose, like when I teach my free will course, which I do every year, and I get to the point where I'm telling them about Newtonian physics and how things work, and then I point out that, of course, we are ordinary-sized, middle-sized dry goods, so our bodies are also, and then I look out and it's as though I took the plug and all value has drained out of the room. Like nothing matters anymore. And it's stunning. It's like, I was just talking about physics. I wasn't talking about ethics. I wasn't, like, suddenly nothing matters. How did that happen, right? So there's something strange and interesting in that capacity.
Strange and interesting is, I think, a good point at which to leave this. It's the point at which we will have to leave it anyway because we're out of time. I see your hand, but I'm afraid we've got to draw things to a close. Pamela Hieronymi, thanks so much for a fascinating talk. And thank you for all your questions.